Should you play Daggerheart? I think this is a question that a lot of people are going to be asking themselves over the next few weeks and months as the team behind Critical Role and Darrington Press have officially released their long-anticipated tabletop role-playing game for free in open beta form. So in this video, I want to go over most of the core mechanics in the game and its design philosophy to help you figure out if it's a game that suits you and your table. Daggerheart describes itself as a heroic narrative-focused experience with combat as a prominent aspect of play. If that sounds a lot like Dungeons & Dragons, well, that's because it uses a really similar description. I think the most telling part of the Daggerheart intro is the last line of the paragraph where it states, "Daggerheart is designed to provide the tools to tell a story that is both heartfelt and epic." This is something of a through line that you will see come up multiple times throughout the playtest document as you read it. But before we talk about that, let's actually talk about how you play Daggerheart. There are currently 9 classes in the game: the Bard, Druid, Guardian, Ranger, Rogue, Seraph, Sorcerer, Warrior, and Wizard. Every class has its own unique set of items and features that help to establish the archetype and the things that a character is capable of doing. It also determines your character's damage threshold, which we'll get to a little bit later. Every class has 2 subclasses right now, which can help to further define a character. Subclasses provide a number of things like spellcasting traits, if they're applicable, foundation features which are unique to the subclass and come in the form of a physical card. Specialization and mastery features are also given by your subclass as you level up and also come in the form of cards. Since we mentioned the cards, it's probably worth explaining that a little bit more. In Daggerheart, many of your abilities and features come in the form of these cards, which you can hold in your hand or place in front of you at the table. You will gain access to more cards and more powerful cards as you level up throughout the game. Some cards have very powerful effects and can only be used a certain amount of times per short or long rest, known as its exhaustion limit, while others just have restrictions on when they can be used in general. You're able to regain the use of certain cards during downtime. You're only able to have up to 5 cards in your hand at any given time, which isn't an issue prior to level 5, but at that point you will need to decide which card goes in your loadout for the day, or which will stay in your vault. In addition to class and subclass though, Daggerheart offers some additional customization in the form of your heritage, which is made up of 2 separate things which are called your ancestry, which D&D refers to as race, and your community, essentially what D&D calls background. Each ancestry offers a unique feature, such as a giant granting an additional hit point slot during character creation, or the Simia, which allows you to make agility rolls that involve balancing or climbing with advantage and add +1 to your evasion at character creation. There are currently 18 ancestries in the game, all with unique flavor and features. The rules also include steps for mixing ancestries together. Your community also grants you a community feature in addition to all the extra lore and background information. Your community features can range from things like the Seaborn's ability to take an additional downtime action during a short or long rest, or the Wildborn's ability to take advantage on any move made without being heard, and to also potentially grant that to an ally. There's currently 9 communities in the game. And if all that customization wasn't enough, Daggerheart has also added something a little bit more unique in the mix that they refer to as domains. Domains are actually core elements of the classes themselves. Every class has 2 domains, and there's 9 domains in total: Arcana, Blade, Bone, Codex, Grace, Midnight, Sage, Splendor, and Valor. What's interesting though is that these domains are shared between the classes. For example, both the Bard and the Rogue share the Grace domain, which means that they will have access to some overlapping abilities given to them by their domain cards, but the characters themselves are still going to be dramatically different from one another by virtue of all of the other customizations available. The game still has 6 ability scores, or character traits as it calls them, and they are Agility, which covers things like sprinting, leaping, and maneuvering; Strength, which is used for lifting, smashing, and grappling; Finesse is used for controlling, hiding, and tinkering; Instinct is for perceiving, sensing, and navigating; Presence is for charming, performing, and perceiving; and Knowledge is used for recalling, analyzing, and comprehending. What's worth noting is that there is no constitution score, as hit points are actually determined by your class, and they've decoupled things like hiding and tinkering from leaping and maneuvering. Both of these would fall under the dexterity ability in Dungeons & Dragons, but this results in that one stat being far less dominant. Alright, so character creation can probably deserve a video of its own, so let's actually get to playing the game. But before that, if you do want me to make more Daggerheart content, please like this video and let me know in the comments. It's the only way I can really tell if this is something that you all find interesting. While the bulk of the game is designed around a narrative element, and we'll get there soon, just about any time rolls are required as a player, known as an action roll, you'll be rolling 2 d12s, known as your duality dice. Each of these d12s must be a different color, one representing hope and the other representing fear. These are kind of like the 2 cosmic forces pushing and pulling on the world and the players, which each have the power to influence and shape the world around you. Rolling your duality dice and making action rolls works much like a d20 roll in Dungeons & Dragons. You're rolling the dice to see if you can meet or exceed a predefined target number or difficulty. If you do, you succeed on the roll. If you don't, you fail on the roll. However, Daggerheart has introduced a pretty significant twist as a result of the duality dice. When you roll the dice, you need to always check to see which of your hope or fear dice actually rolled higher. If you roll higher on the hope dice, you would indicate something like, I rolled a 13 with hope. And if your fear die rolled higher, you would say something like, I rolled an 11 with fear. It's really important to note that regardless of which die actually rolls higher, you can still succeed on the roll, but it can have an impact on what your success or failure looks like. One of the fundamental and underlying rules for Daggerheart is that anytime you make a roll, something is changing. In the game, there is basically no such thing as inactivity or just a failure. The text uses the example of picking a lock, where in a lot of TTRPGs, and even D&D to a certain extent at least, sometimes if you fail a roll, that's essentially it. The lock doesn't open, though obviously a DM can use their discretion to have something else happen or provide some additional information. In Daggerheart though, that additional thing or consequence or information is essentially guaranteed. It has to happen. To continue with that lockpicking example, a failure with hope might mean that you hear the rumble of footsteps coming down the hall behind you. On a failure with fear though, the door might be magically warded, leading to an arcane alarm going off alerting the enemies to your presence. Or on a success with fear, you might get through the door, but there's an enemy waiting for you on the other side. This mechanic suggests that the world that you're playing in isn't static or predefined, but is rather reactive to every roll on a much more macro scale. The GM didn't decide if the door was trapped or not before you got there. Your roll led to a circumstance that created that consequence. Alright, so now it's probably time to actually talk about what hope and fear mean, mechanically speaking. Whenever you roll with hope, that is to say that you made an action roll that your hope die rolled higher on, you get to add 1 hope to your character sheet. You can have up to 5 hope at any given time. You can use a hope to do things like helping an ally, which gives them advantage on an action roll that they are currently rolling. You can also use it to activate an experience, which is an element of your background that could potentially be relevant in something that you're actively trying to accomplish right now. Doing this gives you a modifier to the roll. Or you can activate a hope feature, which are certain abilities that you can only use when you spend a hope on it. When you roll with fear, you don't record anything. Instead, the GM can determine the complication that arises from the roll, but then they also collect a fear that they can use to later power up an enemy or influence the environment in some way. Okay, so we'll talk about combat shortly, but before we do, it's important to explain how armor and hit points and damage actually work because it's really different than what you might be used to from Dungeons & Dragons. Your hit points and damage thresholds are determined by your class. We'll use the Guardian as an example since that's what's in the text. The Guardian can take 6 hit points before potentially dying. However, they don't simply take a hit point equal to the amount of incoming damage. Instead, the amount of damage dealt to a player is compared against their damage threshold, and then a corresponding number of hit points are taken. So that probably sounded a little bit confusing, let's explain it a bit more. Let's say our Guardian here is in combat, and an attack is made against them that deals 7 damage. That amount of damage is compared against our Guardian's damage thresholds, which are minor at 6, major at 11, and severe at 16. In this case, the damage on the attack was 7, that exceeds the minor damage threshold, but it's lower than the major damage threshold, so our Guardian would mark 1 hit point. If the damage dealt had been between 11 to 15, they would have marked 2 hit points, and if the damage had been 16 or greater, they would have marked 3 hit points, which is the maximum damage a player can take in a single turn. If the damage dealt is less than the minor threshold, you instead mark 1 stress. Stress can add up to cause hit point damage to your character, and can also be used as a resource to do things such as dealing additional damage to enemies, but that's a little bit more than we need to get into right now. Alright, so let's talk about armor now. In Daggerheart, armor doesn't actually make you harder to hit like it does in D&D. Instead, armor actually lets you reduce incoming damage by some amount, which can have the effect of putting your received damage into a lower threshold, potentially allowing you to take no damage at all. The Daggerheart equivalent of AC is known as evasion, but they function largely the same. To use your armor, you mark off an armor slot and roll an equivalent amount of d6 dice to reduce the damage by that much. So now that we know how damage and armor work, we can finally talk about combat because it's nothing like D&D. If you've been playing Dungeons & Dragons, you're probably very used to a system where when a combat encounter is about to begin, everyone rolls initiative, you figure out that turn order, and then each round progresses with each player taking their turn at their designated time. Combat in Daggerheart looks nothing like that. There's no initiative in this game. Whenever an encounter is about to begin that is expected to take more than just 1 or 2 rolls, the GM will take out the action tracker. Then, players essentially decide who gets to go in real time. That same player can then even go multiple turns in a row. There is no defined order. It just becomes a free-flowing situation that allows players to work together and devise strategies without being beholden to a defined order. Whenever a player does something, they then place an action token on the action tracker. There is no limit to the number of action tokens in play. You always have as many as you need. Now, the GM can also make a move, which can include moving but also attacking or activating abilities whenever it narratively makes sense or whenever a player rolls with fear. The GM can make as many moves as there are action tokens on the action tracker. However, they cannot activate the same creature twice in the same round. So if there's still action tokens left but they have no more creatures to activate, play passes back to the players. This creates something of an interesting give and take where players need to be somewhat cautious of the amount of actions that they're using, as that can determine just how much the GM can actually do with their creatures. So after a long day of adventuring and fighting, players need to take some downtime. This can be done as either a short or a long rest. When players take a short rest, they can swap any domain cards in their loadout with any domain cards in their vault, and they can choose any 2 of tending to their wounds, clearing stress, repairing their armor, or preparing for the next day. Long resting is essentially the same, except they can choose any 2 of clearing all of their hit points, clearing all stress, fully repairing their armor, or preparing with an ally or working on a project. This is honestly the bulk of the rules. You might have noticed that just about everything I talked about here was either just making your character or the rules for combat. The reason for that is largely because these are really the only reasonably solid and defined rules. You can do, or at least try to do, just about anything that you want to. You're heavily encouraged to describe your actions and how they are interacting with those around you and the environment. The game is an entirely free-flowing one where the reality and consequences of actions are determined in real time based on a choice that you made. Unexpected things can happen, like a mage that you're charging towards crumbling the path behind you, or you manage to get the jump on them before they even realize that you're there. It's almost more of an exciting discussion than a game in some ways. The core of Daggerheart isn't one of adhering to rules. Basically, everything in the text functions on the principle of abstraction. You take an idea or a concept and you just sort of roll with it. You don't even track your gold. Gold literally comes in handfuls, bags, chests, and hoards. When you get enough of one, you just go on to the next one. If you want to tip someone a coin, don't worry about it. You just have the gold. Range isn't even measured in feet or meters, but in descriptions like melee, very close, close, far, and very far, with real-world analogs of the short side of a card or a standard pen or pencil. The entire point of the system is to create a structure where play isn't bogged down by rules and referencing a book, but rather one where players can shape worlds and build stories collaboratively without needing to worry about adhering to a rigid system. And the reason that it does all of this is in the name of growth and development. The game is really all about the impact that you and your characters have not only on the world, but on each other and how you learn and change as a result of your actions and those of your party. Hope and fear aren't just those cosmic forces pushing and pulling on you. They're internal struggles too. You might not succeed on a particular task, but that doesn't mean that you weren't driven by the hope that maybe you can make the world a better place. You might succeed greatly on something incredibly daunting or challenging, but maybe you only did it because your fear pushed you to try just that much harder. Your fear of something greater, something worse. Whether that's an internal fear or an external force is for you and your character and your party to discover together, and there's not really any rules that can embody that. At this point, you probably have a pretty good feel for how the game works, despite not really going in that much depth. So what do I think about Daggerheart, and do I think it's going to be the D&D killer, and should you play it? Honestly, I think the second question is a really easy one to answer, and I think the answer is no. I don't think it's going to be the D&D killer. Now, I do want to stress one important thing here, in that I do truly love the vision for what the team behind Daggerheart is trying to achieve. I think that they've created a beautiful system that allows players to really feel meaningfully engaged in their world without being overburdened with rules. The players can have real, tangible, and immediate impacts on their surroundings through their actions, and not have to worry about whether it's allowed based on a rule, and I think that's just so cool. I would love to be wrong about my prediction here, but the reality is, I just don't think that the vast majority of D&D players are prepared to play a game this loose. And believe me, I get it, the irony is palpable. I've made entire videos talking about how I feel that the critical roleification of Dungeons & Dragons has led to a situation where people are looking for more narrative elements in their games, but I kind of think it's just that. I think people want some more narrative elements and opportunities that are backed up with rules and definitions. The Downtime section of Daggerheart stresses the importance of characters blowing off steam and exploring the various intense relationships that they have and discussing the happenings of the day and how it impacted them and their outlooks. Now, don't mistake anything that I'm saying here for negativity. Like I said, I adore this type of game, but I think a game like Daggerheart is so incredibly table-specific to a level that D&D could never conceivably be. I talk in so many of my videos about how everyone comes to the D&D table for a different reason. They have a different draw to the game, but I'm just not sure how possible that is with Daggerheart. You need such a high amount of buy-in from everyone sitting around the table. It requires that everyone feels a sense of accountability toward the entire story, the narrative, and each other. If you're going to be sitting around the campfire discussing the impacts of the day, you need to be doing so with very like-minded individuals who are also seeking that exact same thing. If you spend basically any amount of time on Reddit or YouTube, it will not take you long to find discussions of toxic players and DMs at various D&D tables everywhere, and as poorly as that works in games like D&D, it would be so much worse in Daggerheart. And it's largely for that reason that I don't really envision Daggerheart being the D&D killer. I think the biggest thing that will likely hold a lot of D&D players back is just how reactionary it is, and if you're not prepared for that, it can definitely rub you the wrong way. Looking back at that lockpicking example from earlier, it was the roll with fear that resulted in the door being trapped, or there being an enemy behind it. This is really different from most other systems where whether a trap or a monster ambush exists was predetermined by the DM before the players got there. Now, that's not to say that things are never improvised on the spot in D&D, but it's just really different when the players know that the door wasn't necessarily trapped, but now it is. This can absolutely go both ways though. Some players might absolutely love that everything has an immediate and measurable impact. I am one of those people. This sounds super rad to me, but I know that there are plenty of players who don't enjoy that experience, and they probably at least won't enjoy Daggerheart because of that. Again, I'm not saying this as a necessarily good or bad thing, it all comes down to personal preference. Something of a key takeaway that I've got from the document as well is that it really does put a lot of pressure on the GM in a lot of different scenarios. Every role can have 5 potential outcomes, whether they succeed or fail with hope, succeed or fail with fear, or they critically succeed. You need to be able to improvise on the spot what each of those circumstances looks like, what are those consequences, what are those benefits, and how does that impact the world around you. Again, improvisation has always been a big part of the game, but this really does take it to another level when it's almost codified into the game itself. Probably my biggest criticism of the game though is that with as much effort as they went into to create a system that doesn't feel bound by rules, they simultaneously made it so fiddly in terms of just how much tracking and micromanagement you actually have to do and how many accessories and just things are required to play the game. Like, even just tracking damage isn't straightforward at all. You have to determine if the creature hits, then you reference your evasion, calculate how much damage was done, convert that into your damage thresholds, decide if you want to use armor to reduce it. If so, how many slots do you want to use? Roll the appropriate amount of dice, reduce the damage, check to see if it went down into a lower threshold, record the hit point or the stress. It's just a lot to do, and that's just for hit points. Never mind that you're also constantly going to be gaining and using hope throughout the game, and the GM also needs to constantly track their accumulated and spent fear. And there's just so many other little things that we didn't even get to, like scars and the other various conditions. It's almost certainly something that will become easier with practice, but it does add to the barrier to entry. Obviously, this is still a playtest and only the first one at that, so I can't help but feel like a lot of these things will get fleshed out and become better and easier over time. On that note, I think the game right now is probably a perfect candidate for playing with digital sheets rather than pen and paper, but hey, that's also just personal preference. One last thing that I wanted to mention is about the cards. Will from D&D Shorts mentioned that he felt like there was no reason for the cards and you should just be able to track everything on your sheet. Now, he's not wrong, you definitely can, but given how frequently you can be changing your cards with every short rest, I actually think it makes them a bit more accessible and one less thing to fill in and erase on your sheet. That said, I do fully agree that I would love to see more interactions with the cards, like creatures that can temporarily send a certain amount of them to a player's vault or something like that. So to answer the principal question, should you play Daggerheart? The answer is a resounding maybe. If the very rules-light, loosey-goosey, heavily narratively driven approach sounds even vaguely interesting to you, then absolutely go for it. Give it a shot. The playtest is currently 100% free. Who knows, maybe you've got the perfect group for it and you find that you love it even more than whatever system you were running before. But if you're the type of player that needs firm rules, or you're a heavy optimizer or a rules lawyer kind of guy, I don't think that this is going to be the game for you, but I'd love to be wrong about that. I'm actually really excited to give it a try. I'm currently planning a playtest of the game, so I'm looking forward to seeing how it all actually plays out. Let me know what you think about Daggerheart and if you're interested in seeing some more content about it, but otherwise, take care.